Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into the podcast. This week I'm going to talk with Lauren Morgan. She's a PhD student at the University of Missouri at St. Louis in the Criminology and Criminal Justice program. She's also a professional water skier, which is an interesting combination. We'll talk a little bit about that. Her field of study, she studies the intersection of the U.S. criminal justice system for juveniles and the juvenile welfare system in the United States. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the problems that exist, some possible solutions that could be employed to make things better. We also talk about the incident with George Floyd, the protests and civil unrest around the country, and the implications that may have for kids in these systems right now. So thank you again for tuning in. If you enjoy these podcasts, please subscribe. And thank you for your time. Enjoy. All right. Hey, thanks for coming and hanging out with us for a little bit. So what are you doing right now? Where are you and what are you doing to sort of ride out the virus?
Yeah, so I'm in Florida right now. I actually just got off the water skied this morning. I water ski a ton, so that's kind of what I do. And it's been nice to kind of get away and I've been, I had to finish school this last semester, but it was kind of nice to get my head out of the school and the hustle and bustle of everything and kind of slow down a little bit and enjoy some family time. So it's been nice.
And that's kind of returning to your roots. What did you did for a living before you
Yeah.
became an academic? What was that?
Yeah, I'm a professional water skier. I still water ski professionally. I'm trying to keep it up. It's a lot harder when you're sitting at a desk all day, trying to keep my body going. I've had dealing with all these injuries all of a sudden. I don't know if I'm just getting old or what's going on, but yeah, I water skied. I guess I've been water skiing internationally and competitively. I was just thinking about it for like the last 15 years now. So it was kind of crazy to think about, but yeah.
And that's sort of like the family business. We've talked about this before. It's a family business.
It's a family thing. My dad was a pro skier back in the 80s when water skiing was much more popular. It was on TV and all that. And then it's been kind of a family sport. My mom does it for fun. My sister does it. My grandparents did it. So it's definitely been a family thing. And then I ended up going to college on a water ski scholarship. So it just kind of grew into that. And yeah, it's been kind of a different kind of background, but I'm really happy I was able to do
Yeah.
it.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of when I think of water skiers, I don't think of academics. I think of like, I don't know what I think because hadn't really thought that much. I've seen water skiing on TV, and I thought, oh, that looks really hard and dangerous. It
Yeah.
looks fun, but I didn't know anything about it. So your dad was a water skier turned physician, and now you're a water skier and you're becoming a professional academic. How does a
Yeah.
person go? So how did you what was your path
Mhm.
from water skier to academic? How did that happen?
Yeah. Yeah. So, so like I said, I got a scholarship for water skiing and I went to a small school in Florida, Florida Southern College, and majored in psychology. And I was never really into school, to be honest. I was just like, I gotta do this to stay on the team. And I wanted to do this collegiate water ski thing because it looked fun. So that was kind of my thing. And then towards the end of school, I started realizing, well, shoot, water skiing is not gonna last forever. So I better figure something out here. And I actually took a course that was like a psych crim crossover course. And it was called like the criminalization of mental illness or something like that. And it was actually taught by my mentor, a good friend of mine. I think you met him at ASC, Dr. Risenslate.
Oh yeah,
And
great guy. Yeah,
yeah,
I loved
yeah,
him.
yeah. So I took that class with him and he was like, hey, like, I think you're really kind of passionate about these things. Have you ever kind of considered, kind of taking this further? And then he brought me to a conference, the Southern Criminal Justice Conference. And then I was just kind of hooked from there. And I was like, all right, it was a little too late to switch majors. I was already a senior at that point. But I was like, I'm going to do a master's in this. And so I moved out to Seattle, started my master's, and then I started working in different internships and things on like the mental health side because that's what I kind of knew. And then I got hooked up with a woman who was really interesting, and she was just kind of like, hey, I have this opening here as a counselor at this group home, and so I started working with foster care. And then that kind of pushed me to want to do more school after that. So that's kind of where I am now. So,
Okay. So
yeah.
it was like you were basically kind of recruited sort of.
Yeah, kind of. I guess I just kind of like kept moving forward. I never really knew what the next step was going to be, but I just kind of kept moving forward and always had a next step plan. And then now I've kind of really found that I have a passion for this foster care kind of thing. So yeah, it was kind of interesting, but I'm happy.
Worked out.
Happy.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of neat. I mean, it's just like any other profession. If you're working in a profession and you're thinking about building the next generation of people that are going to take over from you, and you see
Yeah.
somebody that you think has talent, it makes sense that you'd bring them in and provide some mentorship. So you sort of like are drawn into this idea of studying criminology, criminal justice, and then you had the exposure to the mental health course.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I understand how that might be tied into we'll talk about that a little bit
Yeah.
later. But was there anything in particular about your experience working? Could you talk a little bit about your experience working in the foster care, like in that, was it an internship you said?
At the beginning, and then then when I left, I had finished my master's, and I just kind of continued working for them after that as a case manager.
Can you tell us a little bit about those first experiences? So like you're a professional water skier, you're going to university, and then all of a sudden, I mean, you didn't have any experience growing up in the foster, it wasn't something you were related. So can you talk a little bit about was it what you'd expected? Was it shocking? What was that like? What were you doing, and how did it sort of impact you? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so yeah, I started as an intern, and I started seeing these things, these injustices. I was just like blown away by, so the place where I worked was actually an emergency placement facility. So it was like a short-term stay place for kids who didn't have a foster family. They weren't a good match. They couldn't find a good placement. A lot of them had years of trauma. They're typically on the older side of foster care. So like teenage, 15, 16, 17 years old. And unfortunately, those are the kids that a lot of families don't want because they're harder. And so I actually really related to a lot of the kids. Like, I wasn't one of those people who, you have different people who come in and work at those places. You have the people who kind of want to be in charge and control the kids. But I was more like, let's go play basketball. Let's go do this, more just kind of like, just wanted to hang out with the kids at the beginning. And then I started seeing some patterns that really kind of caught my attention. One was because it was emergency placement facility, we couldn't keep the kids longer than 30 days. Usually we kept them for 14, but if they were doing well, we could keep them a little longer. And it was really unfortunate because you'd see the kids starting to make progress, and then they'd be sent somewhere else. And then that placement, I mean, we knew that it probably wasn't going to work out for them because, they're not used to being in a strict family setting. That's just not what their life has been. So I started seeing some patterns. And then one person, one girl in particular, there's one story that like really stands out to me. And that was, I had a girl who I became really close with over like a couple weeks. And she had been into our place like 3 or 4 different times. And I was like, what's going on with her? Like, she just keeps coming back. And then it was like right around the holidays, and I had worked up to Christmas Eve, and she was there. And then I came back and after New Year, and she was gone. And I was like, where'd she go? And they're like, oh, well, she got placed somewhere. And, that's all we knew. We didn't know where they went. And then she came back, and I was like, oh my gosh, you're back. Like, what are you doing here? She's like, yeah, I ran away. And I was like, well, why'd you run? She's like, I just wasn't happy in that household. There was too many kids, and I just didn't like it. I couldn't do my schoolwork. It was just terrible. And I was like, okay, cool. Well, did you just come straight here? Like, I don't understand. And I didn't know about the foster care system at that point. I was still like learning all this. And she's like, no, I spent the night at the juvenile detention center. And then they put me here today. And she's like, I knew if I ran away, I'd get to come back here because I like it here. And I was like, oh my gosh, so how many times have you been to juvie? And she's like, oh, like 15 or 16 times. And I was like, oh my gosh, like what is going on here? So that just like from then I was like, and I was in this master's of criminology, right? And I was just like, what is going on here? And so that's when I really started like kind of diving in on my own and realizing that the literature wasn't really there either. And so I had to do a lot of my own kind of digging, and that kind of sparked a fire in me.
So it was a connection to an individual and seeing
Mhm.
in real time what the
Yeah.
system sort of does to somebody. And I
Yeah.
imagine when you're telling that story, how hard it would be. So if you're a person who doesn't have a lot of supervision as a youth, and you
Yeah.
don't have a lot of structure, and you're in charge of sort of making your way through life, to then be
Right.
put in a family where they're going to be telling you, it could be really constricting. I
Yeah.
remember we had this reminds me of a story. I'm telling my own story now. We had this with my foster story
Yeah.
experience. Was we interacted with the foster care system as with police officers quite a
Yeah.
bit when I was an officer, and there was this one girl. It's still always, it just, she pops in my mind every once in a while, and she was like the same age as my daughter at the time. um she was like 11 years old or so, and I had written a search warrant. It was like for like they were selling heroin, and we went and served a search warrant on a house selling heroin, and arrested her mom and her
Yeah.
mom's boyfriend and a few people in the house. And um, the little girl was like totally calm. She's like, "Excuse me, officer, um, before we leave, can I just make sure that we have everything I need for my little brother?" And I was like, "Well, what does your little brother need?" And her little brother was asthmatic, and she was like, "Can I ask my mom if she got the albuterol?" And I'm like, walk this little girl out to the patrol car, open the door, and she's like, "Mom, did you get the albuterol? Oh, I left you I told you to." And she's telling the mom, like, "I told you to do these things."
Yeah.
And so this little girl was like taking care of her little brother, taking care of herself, taking care of her mother, managing this home. And then all of a sudden you have these people with guns come in and take everyone, and she's used to it.
Yeah.
And then I'd imagine her being put in a foster care home, and then having some strangers like, "You're going to get up this night, you're going to do this, you're going to do that." How like overwhelming that would be. So I'm sorry to tell that story. I just, when I
No.
was thinking about this, I was thinking about her and wanted to talk about her. So
And it's the same in these group care, congregate care facilities. Like all of a sudden they're being told what to do after being on the street for like a week. You have to go to bed at this time. You got to, make your bed, do your chores. You're eating this at this time, or you don't eat, and all these rules. And the kids just don't respond well at all. And so it's really interesting when you have, like I said, those people who come in and want to control, and it just, they clash. They butt heads, and it's terrible. So,
it's
yeah. So
it's a very difficult job to
it
get somebody and
is.
say, "Hey, you're going to be dealing with," because you have so many, so much, everyone has history,
Yeah.
but like when you're bringing trauma and, the stress and anxiety, it just makes it very difficult
Yeah.
so I can imagine working there would be very, very challenging work.
It was stressful. It got to the point where it was like, okay, I'm really glad I did this and I'm here, and just, the turnover is so high in those jobs because no one can maintain that. And so that was basically where it was. I was like, okay, I'm either going to go to law school or do my PhD and make a difference somehow. And then I actually went to ASC that year. I think I met you there. Um, Met up with Andrea, who was my colleague at Seattle U, and then and Dale and those people. And they're like, you should just apply to some PhD programs. And I was like, yeah, you're probably right. And then it just kind of spiraled. But I was worried about kind of getting bogged down in law school and kind of like the hustle and bustle of law school and just forgetting my passion and why I wanted to do this. So I think the PhD program was a better fit. Definitely.
I think you found like a fascinating. I don't know many people that have considered, studying the intersection of child
Mm-hmm.
welfare. I hadn't really given it
Yeah.
much thought, so I think I'm sure people have been working on it, but it's been
Yeah.
fascinating to meet you and then be exposed a little. Can you tell us, just so people that are listening who may not be familiar with like what the juvenile justice system is? So
Yeah.
everyone sort of has an idea of like, oh, if you do something, you get arrested, you go to jail, but there's a whole sort of system in place around the country in the United States. It's not like this uniform type of thing. But can you just tell us in the United States in 2020, what if you were describing it to someone from who not from the, what would you how would you describe briefly the US criminal justice system in 2020?
Yeah, so the juvenile system. Um, yeah, so the juvenile system is largely community supervision. You know, we don't detain kids anymore, really, and that's for a couple different reasons, and that's really it's a good thing. But there's kind of this mass supervision thing that happens where these kids are being supervised for little, you know, things like status offenses and little things like that. And it's kind of, it ensnares them, really. But the good thing is, like, you know, if you even look back in like the 1990s, like at the peak of like the war on drugs and things like that, we had almost 150,000 kids detained.
Wow.
And now we're down to like less than 20,000. So it's just been this steady decline. Which is like I said is great, but it's transferred into this community supervision and then all the different pathways that we know leads to adult system involvement. So that's what the juvenile system kind of looks like now. It's just like a bunch of they call them deputy juvenile officers in St. Louis, but probation officers supervising these kids, and that's basically what it is. And it is more of a rehabilitative model for sure than the adult system. But, you know, we run into issues of transfer and certification where kids that are 17, 18, they don't know, 16, 17, they don't know. Sometimes they're being urged to transfer or get certified because they think it'll be better and they won't have to have this probation officer looking over their shoulders. And then they go into the adult system and it could go really well. Like the prosecutor could just be like, oh, we're not dealing with this. This is a kid. Or they can be in the system and that's it. You know, so there's a lot more uncertainty there, especially with that certification and transfer stuff. But largely it's a community-based supervision model.
So around the country, you had this large institution holding 150,000 kids, and then over time, there's been this move to de-incarcerate them
Right.
and send them out into the community under supervision. And that supervision is like probation officers, juvenile probation officers. So it's going to take, but what I'm getting at is it's not a nationally run program. Each county is going to have its own thing. So like, do they all look the same or are they different?
Yeah, they're all very different. I mean, well, I can speak to like the differences in Seattle and St. Louis. You know, actually, a couple weeks ago, I'm doing this qualitative project, right? And so I interviewed the chief juvenile officer of St. Louis, and she kind of gave me an example. She's like, back in 2006 was their kind of their peak of incarceration, and they had like 200 kids detained in St. Louis. And now this was pre-COVID, so I assume it's even lower now. But they had like 20 kids that were detained, and it's all, you know, personal offenses, things, assault with a weapon, stuff like that. It's not anything like a status offense or anything like that. Whereas, and it's all dependent on funding. Whereas in Seattle, they're receiving federal funding there, and so in Seattle, there's these different little loopholes, but they can detain a kid for a status offense because one, they do it because there's not enough placements for these kids, and there's like loopholes. So like the young girl I was talking about, so because she doesn't have a valid guardian, there's this thing called the valid court order exception, and if you don't have a guardian, then you can be placed in detention because you don't have a place to go. So in St. Louis, that doesn't happen, which is really interesting. I kind of thought that Seattle would be more progressive in that way, and I was very shocked with that, actually. And I've been really impressed with the St. Louis system. I was shocked to hear that they only had 20 kids, and I think over COVID, I think there's like less than 10 kids being detained right now, so that's great.
Wow.
But it's all dependent on funding, and if they're receiving the funding or not, and if they are, then they have to comply by different rules.
So it's really surprising. This is really surprising to me because having come from out west and then come to St. Louis and then being exposed to the policing in St. Louis and then back out west, and I I would argue that St. Louis is several years behind,
I know.
and has a lot of problems. So I'm kind of really surprised that
Mhm.
the juvenile justice system would sort of, and then when you compare it to a place like Seattle, when I think of Seattle, I would imagine that they would be, trying to embrace science and blah, blah, blah. I say blah, blah, blah. I don't,
Yeah.
I'm a little skeptical of people who think they can use the scientific method to incarcerate people and reform them. But
Yeah, sure.
anyway, what do you think, if you had to guess, what would be your explanation for why a progressive place like Seattle would be falling behind a sort of regressive place like the St. Louis area in many ways?
I think it has to do with money a little bit, and just cost of living, maybe, because uh, it's hard to live in Seattle. I
Right.
mean, you cannot afford to live there. It's just, it's insane. And the homeless population is so high there. I think there's like all these like different homeless communities that are like kind of embraced there. So like a lot of the kids that would run away, they'd go and hang out in Tent City, and they'd have places to go. And it was just like, okay, out of sight, out of mind. Whereas in St. Louis, it's not like that, you know? And I think there's more foster families because they have the means to do that with the lower cost of living and things like that. Because, I don't think foster families obviously get paid, but it makes more sense in St. Louis. The costs are just outrageous in Seattle. And I think that might be a huge piece of it.
That makes
Um,
sense.
yeah. So, yeah, it's just,
So it could be the growing inequality in a place like Seattle makes it so that the people who could provide the structure, they maybe don't care, and then the people who would be willing to do it just can't afford to
yeah,
do it. So like a middle class family in Seattle, the only people who could maybe do it in Seattle are like really wealthy people, and there's a
yeah,
few of them, very few of them. Whereas in a place like St. Louis, it might be easier to like afford to live there. Is that that's kind of what you're getting at?
exactly. And, you see similar trends with like Seattle and LA and Portland and all those cities just because of the cost of living. I mean, but then also all the studies that are kind of done are done out there. And
Right.
so they're like very progressive in that way. But, I come into St. Louis and I talk about crossover youth and they're like, well, what is that? Like they really
Mhm.
don't even know. So it's been interesting to kind of compare the two cities for
Well,
sure.
Seattle too is kind of like a magnet for troubled youth, I would imagine. Like San Francisco,
Yeah.
Seattle, Vancouver in Canada. I know in Canada, if you want to run away from home,
Yep.
you're going to go to Toronto, or you're going to go to Vancouver. Vancouver's a lot warmer, so I'll go to Vancouver. And
Yep.
I think the same thing is true here. If you run, so if I live in Wyoming and I want to run away from home, I'm not going to go to St. Louis. I'm going to go to Seattle, or I'm going to go to San Francisco. So they have a much bigger sort of social problem to manage. I want to, before I forget, I want to apologize because a few minutes ago I said that I criticized St. Louis and said that Seattle was progressive and that St. Louis was regressive. That was not the right way to say it. What I should have said is that St. Louis has been especially hard by deindustrialization, and I mean it's been ravaged and gone from one of the a major American city to a city that's been depopulated. The industry has left. People have really suffered. So the institutions are poor, are not as well funded. There's a long history of racial discrimination in Missouri, and the police department has racial issues. So there's a whole bunch of, and it's very complex. So I love St. Louis. I think it's a fantastic city. So I apologize for saying that it was regressive. So um, I wanted to get that in there before I forgot because I didn't want to get a nasty email. Well, I don't mind a nasty email, but I don't want too many of them.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of the broad strokes of what like this criminal justice system. It's this diffuse set of organizations around the country with a lot of variability, but there's this general move to shift people from being in custody to being on some kind of community release. And then so while you have that institution, there's this other institution working with youth, and it's this child welfare system. Can you talk a little bit about how that looks like? So like in 2020, if a child can't in the United States, if the child can't live at home with their family for whatever reason, safety, whatever, and they don't have a family member to stay with. What does that look like for youth in America today?
So this one is also very complicated and similar to the criminal justice system. It's different in every state, vastly different. And there's also been this movement towards privatization of foster care. So that adds in a whole other element that I'm learning about. And I've really, I was really focused on like the juvenile justice side. And really the last couple of years, I've started learning about the child welfare side. And then I moved to St. Louis and learned about their child welfare side, which they call the children's division. And it's been a learning curve because it's just so much and so many different policies and changes in funding, legislation, and but anyway, there's about 450,000 kids in foster care on like any given day in the U.S. And largely that's due to neglect, but of course there's abuse too. But it's mostly neglect cases, and so these kids, most of them, more recently they started using Kinship Care as a placement for kids, which is really great. Those kids do a lot better.
And that's like that's what what does that mean?
Yeah, so that's like a family member, so like a relative, like an aunt, uncle, or a grandparent, right? And like I said, those kids do a lot better because they have those familial ties. Or kids will go to a foster family, and sometimes those places can be hectic, lots of kids running around, depends, but there's some really great families out there that are doing that. But then a large portion, 15 to 20% are in these congregate care group home facilities, so like boys and girls homes, place where I worked in Seattle. And what's happening there is, so you have that happening, but then you have this decarceration from the juvenile side, and a lot of those kids, they're getting community-based treatment. A lot of places they're going are these group homes too. So then you have these kids who are they're all together at these facilities, and so peer association, you have those issues. But staying on the foster care side for now, I mean, the kids who go to Kinship Care do much better. And then, the group, it just gets worse. So like the group homes, I mean, I worked in one, they're terrible. I mean, it's really just a step down from being in a juvenile detention facility. Everything from like the lighting, it just makes you want to like rip your eyes out. The surveillance, everyone is just watching you at all times. You have all these rules, and like I said, a lot of kids just don't do well. And those typically and the kids that end up in these places are the kids that don't do well in family placements, right? So these are the kids who have mental health issues, older, maybe were involved with the criminal justice system, or juvenile justice system, have behavioral issues. So they really need even more help, but then they're getting it. So it's just a constant cycle and awful, really.
Right. So you have these two that, and you alluded to it a little bit, like
the crossover.
So they're connected in some ways. Is that, so you have the juvenile justice system around the country, this loosely organized system to manage kids that have been, convicted, adjudicated of crime, or in the process of being adjudicated. And then you have children who have been deemed at risk and need some type of assistance, some type of intervention. And so you have some positive things happen with the, people being diverted to being taken care of by family members. But then you also have this sort of connection between these two institutions. Is that something that's formalized and highly structured and managed? What does the connection look like between?
So that's the thing. It's like, and this varies in every jurisdiction. So I'll talk about St. Louis and then I'll talk about Seattle. But St. Louis, you have the juvenile family court system. It's like this overarching system. And then you have the family court side and those hearings, and then you have the juvenile court side and those hearings. And they operate in silos, like they don't connect. There's no data sharing. That's a huge issue, but it's just lack of organization, no communication. And so it's really ill serving the kids because they're getting services over here with the children's division, and then they have their probation officer and services that their probation officer is trying to set them up with, or their DJO. And it's just confusion. No one's working together. It's not wraparound. And so, and then they might end up in a group home or something like that. And you have some kids who might have been just fine in the group home, but then they have this peer association with, a kid who's not doing so well and urges them to go elsewhere. And it's an absolute mess. And there's no agency sharing or data information sharing. So between agencies, so everything from like medications that kids should be using, that gets confused. And I saw that all the time in Seattle. Services, like they might have like 3 different therapists.
Right.
It's really an issue, and things are starting to take place where they're trying to implement like, the Annie Casey Foundation. It's a foundation from Seattle. They were the ones actually going back to like this decarceration movement. They were the ones who kind of put together this reform agenda to decarcerate juvenile detention facilities. So that was kind of their initiative. And then they were kind of like, oh, what about these kids that are kind of in both? And there's something called like the crossover youth practice model, I think it's called. And they're starting to implement that in different cities. We don't really know how that's working out, but it's more of this like wraparound approach, sharing the data, sharing information. But it's hard because, I mean, that takes time, and
Right.
Caseworkers aren't prepared for that either.
So like imagine, let me give you a hypothetical. So say I'm working in a juvenile detention facility in Seattle, and I have a youth arrive, and I don't know how it works in this and there, but so like say they have to there's some type of intake process, and somebody's in charge of ensuring for the welfare of this child and making sure they're where they are, that they're, everything's taken care of. The person in charge of that, so if I'm working at the juvenile detention facility, do I have access to the database being managed by the state child welfare agency?
No.
So I couldn't look and see, how many homes has this child been in, where have they been, what is their, and then, so no. And then on the other side, so say I'm a juvenile probation officer, would I then have, if I wanted to say, oh, what is this, I'm sorry, a child welfare agent, and I'm in charge of placing the child, would I have access to the database to look and see, well, what has this person's history been with the criminal justice system? Is that readily available?
That is more available.
More of it, I would expect.
Yeah, but then a lot of times, sometimes they don't want to know because they want to get that kid in a placement, and it's really about just getting them into a placement, and like try to get let that stuff brush under the table for real. Like, I mean, so in some ways the data sharing might be problematic for kids trying to find placements too. So that's something that we'll have to figure out. But yeah, I mean, they don't really care. It's more of a system. Like it really is. It's more like, okay, let's get them in here. Okay, where's, like, if you're on the juvenile side and you're doing the intake, it's like, and I don't know as much about this because I worked we actually had a partnership with the juvenile detention facility across the street. So I like subbed and worked over there a few nights, but just as, kind of like monitoring kids. So I don't really know much about that side, but it's my understanding that they come in, they do the intake, and then when they go to release, they'll just, if they don't have a guardian, they call the social worker, and then it's the social worker's job to find them a placement as quickly as possible, which is why they would end up in our residential emergency placement facility, right?
Right.
And then the case manager there, which was me at one point, we have to try to find them a suitable placement, and it's just hard. Sometimes you'll be on the phone all night trying to find a kid a place to live, and sometimes they'll be just sleeping in the office on their floor because there's nowhere for them to go. There's a lot of influx, and especially now with that decarceration, there's just not enough placements. And I think that's why in a place like Seattle, kids are being detained more often for those status offenses and things like that, because there's just no other option.
I read, so ahead of this, I read a little bit of the stuff you'd written, and you talk about this idea of the carceral state, this hidden
shadow
carceral state. The shadow carceral state. Can you talk about, well, you just started, can you talk a little bit about that, like what that means and how that plays out with kids in these two systems?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a stretch right now. It's kind of something I'm trying to develop with my qualitative project. So basically, the shadow carceral state is this idea that these different types of punishments that aren't traditional, are kind of trickling down and promoting the growth of a carceral state through like fines and fees and things like that. Catherine Beckett talks about that a lot. And I'm kind of arguing that this is happening at the juvenile level, and she talks about it a little bit too, about the valid court order and the status offenses and things like that. She talks about that. But I kind of argue that like with the privatization of foster care and this kind of, and then bringing in this idea of the organizational battles and barriers there, just the lack of organization, the lack of talking between systems, all these little things are kind of having this trickle down effect to expand this carceral state. So you have these kids that are, that there's more community-based care, but they have these connections now to the criminal justice system. And now they're getting this community-based care, but hey, also that kid is talking to a foster kid that might have been on the right path already. And so it's just this like net widening effect. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. I don't have enough data yet.
No, it's an informing idea, but it's so like you're saying that like you have these two systems, and when they come together in this disorganized, haphazard way, and it's happening alongside this de-incarceration of kids, that basically the state is outsourcing the detention of these children from these institutions to the foster care system, and expanding itself by drawing kids that are in the foster care system into the criminal justice system. So like basically the foster care system and the criminal justice system are coming together to be this massive institution to.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because originally the foster care and juvenile justice system were one.
Right.
And then they kind of thought, and it's interesting because we talk about, in juvenile justice, we talk about like the child savers and these reformers that thought that the juvenile court would be this like great idea, but really a lot of people argue that it wasn't, because before that they weren't really controlled, right?
What did it look like before? Like, what did it look like before? Like before this separation? What did it look like? Can you just tell us quickly about what that looked like?
It's interesting. It depends. There's a lot of like racial differences in that, younger Black youth they were under the slave system. I mean, especially in the South, like they weren't even considered part of the juvenile system or the foster care system at all. So that was separate. And that's kind of like the Black child saving movement. And that's another interesting thing. But the foster care system, just those kids who were kind of dependent and runaway, homeless, street youth, they were just kind of picked up and hung out on the streets, and then were in the juvenile justice system, and that was kind of it. And then the foster care system didn't really become super formalized and separate until like the 1930s-ish time. And then and then they had their kind of own separate progressive reform movement too before that, where they're like, we need to do something with these kids. And that kind of urged that separation and like pointing out that these kids are different than the criminal kids, right?
Right.
And so like in a lot of ways, I thought that would be a great thing, but then it's kind of gotten to this point where they're separate, but then there's a lot of kids that are still crossing over, and they're not, and they're kind of like, I say like falling between the cracks, because they're kind of going between both systems. And
these are the crossover youth.
These are crossover youth. And we can talk about that a little bit, but crossover can happen like so many different ways, right? Like you could have a youth who was in the juvenile justice system, and then when they go to be released, there's no one there, so they put them into children's division, or they're on the child welfare side, and they get picked up while they're running away, or they get arrested, and then they realize that there's a dependency or neglect issue there. So that it can happen all different kinds of ways, which really makes it confusing to kind of get good numbers on how many of these kids there are. There's different ways you can do it. You can look at juvenile justice samples or child welfare samples, and it's really hard and confusing, and those numbers are kind of all over the place, which is why I assume, and that protection makes juvenile justice a really hard avenue to study, but then that element of foster care, double protection makes it even harder to study. So
Right. And imagine if you have so you have different agencies all over the country, two different mechanisms. They're loosely organized. So there's nobody in charge of collecting data and in one place. So it would be very difficult. Is this is sort of something that would you say this is something that hasn't been given the amount of attention that it just should be given?
yeah, especially, I mean, I think on the social work, child welfare side, like childhood studies side, that I think it has been tapped into, and they kind of like, oh, and then, but they very like, they'll briefly go over like the juvenile justice involvement piece. But that's been really helpful. That's kind of where I've been pulling a lot from. But on the juvenile side, they barely ever talk about that. And I have even talked to like, pretty prominent like juvenile justice scholars, and they're like, yeah, it's just, we don't really like tap into that because it's hard to get good samples on that, and just that protection element it makes it really hard. So it's definitely not been tapped into, which is why I kind of started with like a qualitative approach to start things out, and trying to hopefully move towards like a mixed methods thing for my dissertation, where now that I'm like in these different agencies and things in Seattle or St. Louis, sorry. I am kind of in there, and they can maybe help me get data, so that's kind of my approach right now. But
so you're early on, you're just getting started in your academic career, but you have quite a bit of experience working and doing your research. When you look at, you have this sort of organic thing, and then over time you have these systems develop, and you come up to where we are right now, and you look forward into the future. If you were dictator perpetua in charge of everything, and you could say, okay, I'm going to fix this, here's what we're going to do you have some policy recommendations? And they don't necessarily need to be like totally realistic that you get them passed, but like, how would you, if you were in charge, how would you manage? Because we're in a post-industrial society. We 350 million people. We're going to have kids that don't have safe place to stay. We're going to have kids that are engaging in dangerous behavior that we need to detain. I mean, I think that's a reality of living in a society like ours. How would you shape that? How would you structure that?
Yeah, it's kind of, my approach is like a little bit out there. I would, if I could choose, I would probably just get rid of the whole juvenile court system and focus more so on the child welfare side, and build that kind of like child welfare policy, right? And just really focus on that. If we had to keep a juvenile court system, obviously strengthening that connection between the systems, right? So like, not two different courts, one juvenile court or one family court that has a little juvenile component to it for, kids who, maybe are waiting before they're getting transferred to adult court or something like that. But, and I think we're actually, it kind of seems like we're kind of moving towards something more similar to that with this decarceration thing. And I think the Casey Foundation is kind of on the same track as that too. But yeah, more like increased child welfare policy, really focusing on, if these kids aren't going to have a family, then building other protective factors. So more, better community-based programs and, job preparation, things like that to help them in the transition, because that's where I mean, for these kids who don't find a good placement and kind of jump around from placement to placement, those are the ones who really have issues in the future. So those are the ones who are going to end up in the adult criminal system. Those are the ones who are going to be welfare dependent. Those are the ones who are going to end up homeless. And that's what we see. So really focusing on those youth, strengthening those programs to get them into college, to get them to transition better. A lot of these kids, they have the choice to stay in St. Louis, and in Missouri, they have the choice to stay in foster care till 21, but they also have the choice to emancipate from foster care. And a lot of people and a lot of kids don't know that stuff. Like, they don't even know that they can stay in foster care. And in Missouri, you can get your college completely paid for.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's amazing. I mean, and people don't know those things. Like I was actually talking to this with the Judge Jimmy Edwards. He was telling me, yeah, like I encourage all the kids, because he was a family court judge for like 7 years in St. Louis. And he was like, I encourage all these kids to just stay in foster care as long as they could. And that's great. You know, that transition period is what we need to focus on too. But first, if we had to keep it how it was, sharing data would be number one. And having more of like a wraparound approach, kind of, you know, this like crossover youth practice model. It seems like it's going to be really positive. So we'll see how that goes. But something more along those lines, wraparound services, connect the probation officer with the caseworker, with the mental health therapist, have everyone connected and move from there, or really just scrap the juvenile system.
Scrap it
And
all together.
focus on the kids. I mean, they're just kids, you know?
Yeah, they're just kids. And the other thing is like thinking about, why is it that in America, the richest country in the history of mankind, that we have so many families who are struggling the way they are? And like housing instability, employment instability, you know, like lack of resources and opportunities, and just, you know, disgusting levels of wealth inequality put massive amounts of pressure on the American family. And these children, a lot of them are being, you know, squeezed out of families by all of this pressure. So as a society, it makes sense to provide resources to families so that we don't have kids being forced out of homes into the system, who then have all kinds of problems. They're, you know, then we have to incarcerate them. We have to provide, you know, it makes so much more sense to just say, hey, we're going to spend this money strengthening families
Now, yeah, and spend the money now so that they're set up to be positive members of society later. I mean, it just, yeah, you know.
Yeah, it's a little frustrating. What so you're learning about this problem, the social problem. You're developing some theories. You have some ideas for policy, some ideas for your dissertation. What comes after this? So when you finish your dissertation, you graduate, do you want to work in an academic role? Do you want to work in a nonprofit and government? What do you see yourself doing for the future?
Yeah.
In the future?
Yeah, right now I see myself working in policy. That could change, but you know, even when I just had our annual review meeting, you know, with my committee and everything, and I kind of brought up the idea of I want to get it out into more of an interdisciplinary approach too. I'm kind of feeling a little restricted by like the strictly criminology atmosphere in a way. I want to branch out into like you know, the child welfare, the family court review stuff, those kind of journals, and start publishing out there a little bit more for right now. And they all encourage that. And then also I have another year of coursework right now. So like we're thinking about like the near future. I'm actually looking to take a child welfare policy class in lieu of our policy class at UMSL. And Beth is supporting me in that, my advisor. And so that's really exciting. I'm excited to learn more about like welfare policy, because I don't really know a lot about that. So I definitely want to go into policy right now. That's kind of where I'm at, but I guess that can change, but I think.
Cool. That totally makes sense. I think it's interesting that you just talked about what you just touched on. I think is important as well, as this how insulated disciplines are.
Yeah.
Like the criminology, I've noticed that, and all of disciplines are the same, because it makes sense that you want to strengthen your discipline so that the department, you know, so there's like you're part of that institution, but like the people like reading the same journals, citing the same people, getting the same theories and retreading them over and over, because you are going to be able to get it published in a journal if your journal article is being reviewed by somebody who you're citing a lot and who they cite a lot, and you're part of that. And it becomes this very incestuous sort of community of people, which, you know, like all disciplines are like that. So I commend you for recognizing that and making a concerted effort to go outside. And what do you think that adds? So if you get a field like like criminology, and then you say, hey, I'm going to really push to do interdisciplinary work and draw on a new body of literature. What does that do?
Hopefully it broadens perspectives. I mean, I was actually just talking, I don't know if you know who Jeff Ward is. He's a sociology professor over at WashU.
Uh-huh.
And he was actually on Dr. Marissa's committee at Irvine, but just moved to St. Louis. And I met him at a talk over there. And then, and he's interested in like race and juvenile justice. So, just connecting with him was pretty cool. And I talked to him for about 2 hours the other day about how you can really just take any class. And he talked about in his grad school approach, he was like, I took some like history of jazz classes and like environmental justice classes and things like that. And he was like, it wasn't really about like the material. It's about learning different ways to write and learning different ways to reach people and different ways to study things. And I think, learning from like the social work side, I'm just like, oh, this is a completely different way, more like case studies and different way to learn things. And for the last 5 years I've been in this like criminology mindset of like, okay, you do this like lit review and then you do your, it's just like this like strategic thing. And it's like, it's been really cool to kind of branch out. And on that side, everyone seems like really interested, and they're like, well, you're like the criminology person, so you can bring this perspective.
Right.
And
It's the cross-pollinate.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think like, why do we have to be like, why do we have to be in silos? Why does it have to be? I don't know. Yeah, I just don't.
Really. I found the things that I've read that are from completely different disciplines, but that are they may be related to the idea, but they're in a completely different discipline. Sometimes those are the things that stick in my mind the most. Like I took a class on the conquest, so it was like on the conquest of the quote unquote new world, and it was all about the conquistadors and that, and how their conquest. And one of the books they assigned was like The Body of the Conquistador, it was called, and it was about how the Spanish state controlled what food settlers were, or conquistadors were consuming while they were in the New World, and it was how identity was managed through food, blah blah. But it was like something I'd never thought about. It was in a time that I'd never thought about, with human beings that are operating in a completely different socio-cultural operating system, but the basic stripped down ideas about how you control human beings and shape a society, those are there when you put them in another context and you step outside of your literatures, and it's like, oh wow, it's like there's an insight there that I can see. So I think it's incredibly valuable, and again, something to definitely focus on moving forward.
Yeah, for sure. I'm enjoying it.
Go ahead.
No, I'm enjoying it.
Enjoy. Let me. So I've had you on here for quite a while. I just wanted to ask you about one more thing. So keep up the good work, and anyone who's interested, I'm going to put a link to your information in the description so they can check you out and follow you as you move forward through your career. What's going on right now? I just wanted to shift gears because this is I think this is a major event with what happened in Minneapolis, George Floyd, and he was murdered, and we just had an arrest. Can you talk a little bit about, just maybe give some of your thoughts, and then if you could talk about what type of an impact this series of events may have on youth who are in these systems that you're describing, and especially like young Black youth, so who are going through the system, what you think, based on your experience, like the message that this may be sending, what's happening.
Yeah. So first of all, just obvious, my heart is just goes out to the Black community right now. Two things have kind of like stood out to me, and one is just the silence around a lot of these things from different communities, and it's just kind of deafening to me. And it's been really hard on me, actually, like the last just couple days, just like, I can't believe like how many people are like so quick to talk about the riots and the uproar, but not the events that preceded that, and just kind of missing the point. And so trying to have these conversations with different groups like outside of academia that may have not had the privilege to have, to be educated on these things, and race as an issue. People are just uncomfortable to talk about it. So trying to have these talks with people it's been draining, to be honest, and really unfortunate. So I kind of feel helpless right now, just reaching out to my friends saying, hey, I'm here with you, I see what's going on. I'm not Black, but I understand that I don't understand what you're going through, but I am here with you, and I'm next to you. And so just that, and then, from a legal standpoint, the fact that he was charged with former Officer Chauvin was, charged with third-degree manslaughter. It just kind of seems like a slap on the wrist, pulling that intent piece out of it. It was just I don't know, like just deflating, really.
Yeah, and how long it took as well.
Yeah, that is a whole nother issue, and so that is just, it just seems like maybe he may even just get off of like probation or a couple years, sentence, and it's what's sad about it is it's really not surprising, and so it just, yeah. But in terms of Black youth, I was actually thinking about what it would be like working at the group home right now. And man, in Seattle, it's different because a lot of the kids, they're really interested in race. They would always, this is like kind of funny to me in a way. They would always be like, well, what are you? Like, they would ask me things like that. And I always thought I was really cute. I'm like, I'm just, I'm like white, Caucasian. I don't know. They're like, no, like you got to be like tribal or something. I'm like, no, I'm not.
I'm boring.
But yep, I'm just white. And, but they, they're like so interested in race. And I think that like with social media and things, kids are.
And it's also because it's so important to their lives, and they know how much of an impact it's going to have on their life opportunities. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you're right. But and also like the racial makeup in Seattle is predominantly white, right? And so they're just so interested in it, and it's like a big part of their identity, and they really love talking about it. And so I was just kind of imagining if I was there at this time, and I'm sure we would be having some really like interesting group discussions because they're just interesting to listen to. But I think social media is going to be a huge piece of that. These kids are seeing these things, and I don't, at that age, I wasn't really on social media at that time. And so I was just hearing things from my parents or, and that was like a one-sided perspective, but I think kids now can make their own opinions on things. And I think it's powerful. I think their voices are going to be heard more. And I think social media is going to be a big role in that. I mean, it's just crazy. I mean, I'm now at the point where I'm making my own opinions. Like, I feel like it's like these last few months have just been insane. And I'm like finally at a place where I can be like very confident in my opinions and speak out. But these kids are like learning that from a younger age, I think. And I think that's pretty powerful.
Absolutely. And like you talk about the social media, I think like this wouldn't be happening if it wasn't for social media. I mean, what would have happened, 15 years ago if this incident had happened is there would have been a police report, it would have been a ruled an in custody death. There may have been some kind of investigation, and that would have been it. But with this incident, you have individuals who are holding in their hand a device that can capture moving images at a high frame rates with high definition with audio, and that they've become cost effective enough that everyone has one. Yep. Then when you have that in your hand, you're connected to a network that allows you to upload those images and share them with everyone on the planet if it goes viral. So something that would have been a quiet and little heard of encounter in a city somewhere in the United States where some unknown Black man who we would have never known his name lost his life, because of this technological innovation, it's become something that could fundamentally transform the very nature of our society. Yeah. So we live in crazy, strange times for sure. I
Yeah.
can't imagine being one of those kids in there, and it's a freaky sort of experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And no one in particular, no one to talk, no family to talk to about it or have that generational talk. And so it's just terrible, terrible
Yeah,
times for
it's
them.
awful.
Yeah.
But I am somewhat, I'm I'm never optimistic. I'm a pessimist, but um, I think that these things we need to confront them. I mean, we need to push through these issues, and this is the time.
Yeah.
There's no time. So thank you so much for your time. Before we go, I just wanted to give you like a minute. Do you have any final thoughts or anything you want to leave the listeners with?
Not really. I just hope that, I would love to connect with anyone who is interested in even just juvenile justice, because it's just, even that is just a very small field. So I'd love to connect. I'm always up to do like, like a panel or something at a conference would be really cool. I'm trying to get one together for Western criminology. Um, and I would love to do that. That's just something I want to do moving forward, because I've always been like one of those like odd people in the panel, like of, you know, I don't know. I'm just like the only one talking about juvenile justice. So I'm like, why am I here? So I would
Well,
love.
if you're interested in Lauren's work or collaboration opportunities, can you shout out your Twitter handle real quick?
Yeah, it's Lauren Morgan Ski, SKI.
Okay, and then what's your email address real quick?
My email is l.morgan@umsl or mail.umsl.edu. Yeah.
Okay, and I'll put both of those, and anything else you send me you want for contact info, it'll be in the description below, both in the audio and video format of this. Thank you so much again for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you, and we really appreciate your insights.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.